So there's so many hidden factors in owning horses, and there's no benchmark. The only benchmark is
when you do the calculation, you got to look at what it costs you to feed that horse per feed per day rather than.
Welcome everyone to episode 154 of the Send Nutrition Podcast with your hosts Bryan and Peter today. And on today's podcast, we're talking about the hidden costs of budget feeds, why cheaper isn't better. How are you, Peter?
Bryan, I'm extremely excited, but I'm also extremely worried. We've got a Christmas party just around the corner and I haven't had a drink for a couple of months. So I'm worried about the hidden cost of a hangover after Christmas party.
The good thing is we're having a nice dinner, Italian, and that'll line your stomach, Pete.
Thank you, Bryan. You're always looking out for me.
Yeah,
I appreciate that.
And I will look out for you after that too. What we're talking about today is the false economy of a budget feed. And when we look at how we feed the horse according to its physiology, cheaper is not always better.
Absolutely, Bryan. This is a pretty hot topic on the diet consults that we do. Look, it always comes up, obviously, with the current economic times. A lot of people are looking at sort of sharpening the pencil, see, what they can remove that the horse may possibly not need, or if they're doubling up on anything. And we've done enough of these consults now to see a pretty startling fact that, a lot of these feeds, the cheaper feeds, they're designed at a much higher feed rate compared to what we can offer. And pretty much in this podcast, we're going to outline how cheaper isn't always better, but more so it's not actually economically cheaper either.
Yeah, 100% agree, Pete. And we're just trying to dispel the myth that a $28 bag, for example, saves me money. Or when you look at how I'm saving on this side, are you really saving in the long run? Like a cheap feed isn't actually cheap when you look at the overall health of a horse.
Yeah, so we have to look at the feed individually, look at the ingredients, but more so look at the feed rate of that actual cheaper feed. How does it compare to a feed that may be double in value? Do you have to add, a vitamin mineral premix into the base of the cheap feed? So there's a lot of different factors that I find it pretty startling that a lot of people don't turn the bag over and look at the actual ingredients and the feed rate. They're more concerned about, the flashy label at the front, and it's got those keywords, whether it might be cool and calm or it's a nice bright sort of sparkling color. That's okay to a point, but you really got to look at, when you do the calculation, you got to look at what it costs you to feed that horse per feed per day rather than the price shock of a $55 feed compared to a $28 feed.
Yeah, you're almost paying twice when you have to add those fortified vitamin minerals to a cheap feed that you have. And when you're trying to bring up those levels, when you look at the true cost involved per feed, not the actual bag cost, it can be more. And it can be summarized with these two simple words. It's a false economy. And in plain terms, you might feel like you're saving $10 on a bag, but in actual fact, you're paying more per feed to your horse because it's the overall diet you got to take into consideration. And I'm only generalizing here, but you might save $10 on a bag of feed. You might spend $300 at the vet due to that poor ingredient list that they try and put together to keep that bag cost down.
Yeah, it's well said, Bryan. And look, it's hard for the average consumer to see that because they're not going to see the problem till further down the track rather than looking at it, well, I'm going to feed healthy and not possibly have that problem further down the track. So I know with yourself and myself, we're very big on sort of healthy diets. And look, I'll give a silly example. When you buy a T-shirt that's 100% cotton compared to 100% polyester, that polyester you wear it 3 or 4 times, couple of washes, it's ready for the bin. The 100% cotton T-shirt's going to have the longevity. It's, you won't smell as much when you wear it in the summertime. See, that's a pretty silly example, but it's a factual example that you are actually getting what you're paying for, and you are getting longevity out of that 100% cotton T-shirt.
Yeah, and when we look at the horse, as the physiology really suggests what we should be feeding, they are hindgut fermenters first, and we are a broken record when we go on about the foundation of the diet being that amount of roughage, or sufficient amount of roughage being that minimum 1.5% of their body weight. And they're designed for that fiber, quality protein, slow release energy. The horse is not designed for inconsistent nutrition, high starch, high filler, bulk feeds, and feeds that require double to triple the recommended rate to meet the requirements. It just goes against our mantra, but it actually goes against the physiology of the horse's mantra.
I think a lot of people have been educated, whether it's self-education or sort of educated by the other feed companies, that unless their horse gets 4 to 6 kilograms of food per day, some people actually think that they're starving their horse, but yet they've got a 10-acre paddock that's grass to their knees and the grass gets ignored. So as Bryan mentioned, horses are being fibre fermenters. They've evolved on pasture or hay if you don't have any pasture. Don't discount the roughage part, because a horse will eat 8 to 10 kilograms of pasture in a 24-hour period. And what your job as the owner is then to try to fill in those gaps and holes that the pasture or hay for that matter may have, rather than focusing your energy and giving that horse 6 kilograms of a grain or grain byproduct hard feed. Now you've bloated the horse with the 6 kilograms, and there's no way that it's going to eat the recommended amount of pasture or hay.
Yeah, definitely. It really is not going to ingest that amount that keeps their digestive tract in its most thriving condition. That's that indigestible and digestible fiber in the roughage or from the hay and the pasture. And by feeding that 4 to 6 kgs of that hard feed, it makes that cheap budget feed bag look expensive for the cost per feed rate. These higher feed rates, they contain more starch for that horse. You're going to have more hindgut upsets, more manure, more inflammation, and there's a greater metabolic roller coaster happening because you're shortchanging what they evolved on, and it is that roughage volume.
Yeah, absolutely, Bryan. I'll give a comparison with vitamins and minerals. So we've looked at a couple of different feeds sort of on the market and compared it to our grain-free ultimate. And I'll use the iron to zinc to the copper ratio. So Australian soils are very high in iron, same as a lot of the hays. And a lot of the products on the market, they've got pretty low zinc and copper ratios to try to counteract that high iron, which naturally comes out of the roughage. So for argument's sake, the 3 or 4 different feeds we looked at, we had per kilo. So we've got roughly 900 milligrams of zinc and about 300 milligrams of copper. That's per kilo. Compared to some of the other feeds on the market, you had to feed 5 or 6 kilograms to get the equivalent zinc and copper. Okay, so that's huge. People are going to be like, oh, well, look, my horse is fat. I can't feed 6 kilograms of this other feed. I'll drop it down to 3 kilograms. So what happens without the person knowing is you're actually shortchanging that zinc and copper now, where that feed is designed to be fed at 6 kilograms. You're feeding it at 3 kilograms. So the horse is getting 50% less zinc and copper that it's supposed to get. And the customer's worried because the horse is going to get too fat feeding the high amount. So you're sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul, and you're stuck in no man's land because you don't want to get the horse to get even fatter with the 6 kilos, but you're feeding 3 kilos, which is not giving the right amount of vitamins and minerals.
Yeah, it definitely highlights its quality over quantity, and the devil's in the detail when you turn over the bag and look at those levels. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to promote a better way of feeding in terms of really zeroing down on what the horse really requires in its hard feed to complement their anatomy, which is their hindgut is where the majority of the energy is coming from. And we don't want to overload this system on things that are meant to be digested in the small intestine.
Absolutely. And this sort of relates a little bit to the people that do the, I call them the DIY, the do-it-yourself diets. They might have a BPOP as a carrier. They may have, some sort of vitamin mineral powder or maybe a concentrated pellet. And, then they're still adding a gut supplement and adding, a bit extra calcium because they may have high oxalate pastures, and then they may think that the horse is a bit rowdy, so they add magnesium. By the time you calculate those 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 things that you're feeding that horse per day, look, sometimes people get a shock when we go through diet consults. They could be spending between $12 and $15 a day when they actually calculate each individual ingredient and the cost of that ingredient per day.
Yeah, and the kicker there is they're not getting the result, and that's why they come out and contact us.
Absolutely, Bryan. And it's about putting everything back into balance. They've got, the best intentions in the world, obviously, to try to balance that diet. But, they may be, talking to a friend that says, give some magnesium. Another friend saying, oh, your phosphorus is low. Another friend saying, well, your zinc might be high or it might be low. And there's a lot of noise in the industry and everyone's preaching a different message. So I feel a bit sorry for some of the people that that we talk to, and it's even more motivation to help them out because you could tell that they're frustrated. They've got a headache. The horse is not looking as their expectations are. And especially in a lot of cases, they're spending their hard-earned money, $10, $12, $15 a day. I mean, the horse should be looking $1 million, not, not 50 cents worth.
Yeah, 100%, Pete. And when we were going back and talking about if you do go for that budget feed, it could lead to vet bills down the track. What we mean by this is if you, for example, when Pete talked about that underfortification of the vitamin minerals, on a chronic basis or day after day basis, if you're supplementing or not providing your horse with the right amount of trace minerals per day for its body functions, including the immune system to function properly, it's going into a chronic state. And day after day, they're more susceptible to infection or inflammation in that way. And this can add up over time to issues that may require a vet. So that's how a budget feed can directly impact that bottom line. And it's also the other quality of low quality ingredients they use. So it could be cheap byproducts in inconsistent supply chains. They may be shortcutting on their manufacturing processes to keep that bag cost down. Again, you have to be really careful there because the horse's gut can be very sensitive to change. And if there's bag to bag inconsistency with the main ingredients, then you're going to get trouble and you didn't even know you had trouble because everything you think is the same when it's not, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely, Bryan. And look, most diets that we recommend on the consults always start with the right amount of roughage, and whether that's hay or whether that's pasture. And then obviously we look at, well, what type of pasture, possibly if they have a pasture analysis, even better. If not, we can still have a high quality guess. And then we try to build a diet around the roughage, where we find that some of the diets that come through, they'll be very heavy handed on the hard feed. The horse is not eating enough roughage, and that's why they're experiencing those gut health problems. The horse might be dropping weight. And it's funny, like sometimes the more hard feed they feed, the horse drops even more weight because there's an oversupply of sugar and starch. The horse obviously is not handling it. Some of it may be going from the small intestine into the hindgut where it's not supposed to be, and then the horse is basically trying to stay alive, but yet it's got all this feed coming through, and it's a pretty vicious cycle.
Yeah, one of the other aspects that blows my mind is when we get a diet and the horse, or the reason they asked for the consult was poor top line and muscle development, but they're feeding 5 kgs of this budget feed. It really makes you wonder the amino acid profile in that feed is not up to scratch to really repair the horse's muscles that are in work. And that's another added risk you run when you're looking at these budget feeds.
And Bryan, just further on to that too, you make a good point with the muscle development. I give an example. Sometimes it's like us thinking that we could have a protein shake, 3 times a day, and we're going to have a fully balanced diet. It doesn't work that way. We have to eat food as well, obviously, for protein, fat, fiber, everything else. But the big kicker is, I think, for the digestive system. You mentioned, obviously, the high sugar, the high starch. That plays havoc with the digestive system, where we know 70-75% of the immune system is located. So we got to get the right amount of fermentable fiber. We've got to make sure that we've got fat in the diet. We are getting quite a few on the consults horses with pretty poor hooves. Fat is required for healthy hooves. It's not just a silver bullet, which everyone thinks is biotin. Biotin is critical, but it's not the silver bullet where you're going to feed biotin and your horse, remarkably is going to have healthy hooves in 3 weeks.
Yeah, 100%. And one of the aspects you did just touch on is that fat source. And we can make this a little bit more dramatic and say that these budget feeds sometimes contain a fake fat source. And this is a problem because a cheap oil as a filler can be really detrimental to the overall health of your horse, as they are not up to scratch in the omega profile wise, but because of the processing that we undergo with pellets, they can be rancid or partly rancid, which is not ideal for your horse's body because these are converted to free radicals once in the gut and the bloodstream, and free radicals are not what is required in a horse to help them recover or to have them thrive in domestication.
Just further on what Bryan just mentioned there, so you do see look quite a lot, probably 90% of the different feeds on the market, they do have some sort of oil through them. And look, there's a few reasons why those oils get added. One is to help binding. When you bind a pellet, having molasses or oil makes the pellet look nice and shiny and, no dust. So I sort of get it from a manufacturing point of view. But it's almost like the example I've given 100 times is, I'm going to deep fry my chips and then I'm going to get that oil and sprinkle it over my Caesar salad. No one does that. And I mean, it's a bit of an extreme example, but that oil, as Bryan rightly said, is most likely rancid because of the heating process that it's gone to turn that food with the oil into a pellet form. And now the horse has got to try to get rid of those free radicals, as Bryan just outlined. So, the second option is it's used or it's advertised, we've got an oil in our feed, you don't need to feed an oil. Well, in essence, that's true. But if the oil is rancid inside the feed, you're really using up valuable energy for the horse to detox itself from the rancid oil rather than using that oil as an energy source, as may it have been advertised that way.
Yeah, and we get often asked what those free radicals actually do in the horse and what negative effect. Well, they damage the cell membranes. They don't promote recovery, so they have a slower recovery, increased muscle soreness. It can actually increase the risk of tying up, reduce the energy in the horse, impair immune function, and increase systemic inflammation. So when we look at the whole diet of the horse, these fake fat sources are not really helping their physiology. And more so, I think another fact is when you look at a bag or any feed bag and it says it's high in energy, this is what they're trying to use the energy source from, which is that the fat is a high fat, high energy pellet. Well, beware of that, because 9 times out of 10, that fat source is rancid because it's not stable, it's exposed to air. And what we promote is not having that oil in the pellet, because when you add it to your horse's feed, the fresher the better. And we add it at the time of feeding, and that's where the scent oil comes into.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a little bit smoke and mirrors. People think they're getting a very high energy feed, and look, some guys even put up to 10% of oil into their feeds, which is quite a lot. My thinking is the more oil that there is in that feed, if it's heated and it goes rancid, the more damage that feed's going to do. So it's almost like the higher the oil content, the worse it is for the horse. And look, some horses are going to be able to cope with that amount of oil. But what we said at the beginning of the podcast is, what's the long-term damage that's going to get done? Like I know Bryan and I, we don't sort of cook in seed oils. We're big on the Australian 100% tallow, beef tallow, very, very flavoursome. It's good to see that there's more tallow companies sort of popping up, and the seed oils are getting sort of knocked over the head a little bit, which they rightly deserve. But there's no room, in our opinion, for these cooking oils inside horse feed, because just the damage that's done long term far outweighs not having them in there.
Yeah, it's consistency in feeding time after time. You're not just feeding this feed once a week or once every month. We're feeding our horses every single day, and what goes into them is expressed out somewhere in their body. And when we look at the technology we don't need to add the oil to our feed, and it's not something there to cut costs, because we can squeeze other ingredients that are actually viable for the horse and actually help their health long term. And we know that when you add a plant-based omega-3 oil fresh at the time of feeding, that has way more benefits than a rancid oil in a pellet.
Absolutely, Bryan. Maybe we go into the performance side of things, why cheap feeds limit athletes. You want to just dwell on that for a little while?
Yeah, so when we look at cheap feeds, the balance of nutrition in them can be shortchanged, and you need really good amino acid profiles. So when you have a cheaper grain source or a cheap ingredient profile, you may not be hitting that. You need that balance of trace minerals and inflammatory nutrients. So going back to not having that oil in that feed, you want to correct any high sugar and starch that's coming from the ingredients, which the cheap feeds don't do. And one of the side effects of these budget feeds is you can lead to less stamina, slower recovery, and higher tying up risks just due to that ingredient profile.
And that's the heat that basically generates from the omega-6, which is the cooking oils, and from the grain or grain byproducts, the meal runs, the barley, the corns, the oats. It makes me laugh sometimes. Some of these feeds, we won't name any names, but they'll have it plastered on the front of the bag, oat free, but yet the first ingredient is barley at 70% starch. So it's like 55% oats is like the devil, but yet 70% barley gets the tick of approval.
Yeah, and it's actually known that oats is the safest grain compared to corn and barley due to the structure of the starch in it and the way the horse can break it down before the hindgut. So it's really it is really a minefield out there, and we have to really be onto it to see the effects that it will have with our horses.
I think it comes down to the consumer actually taking time to flick the bag over from the glossy marketing spiel gimmick at the front, flick the bag over and actually read the ingredients. If you don't know the ingredients like we do inside out, a good rule of thumb, which I've mentioned in previous podcasts, is look at the fiber level. So most feeds that are low in sugar, low in starch, you're going to have a very high fiber. And I mean very high. Anything above 20% is probably the minimum. Our grain-free ultimate sits around about the 33, 34, 35. So we're in the very high fiber, but you probably don't want to touch with a 10-foot pole anything below 10%. That's normally I won't say the sweepings off the floor, but it's not the most nutritious ingredients that are in there to have such a low fiber level. And those low fiber levels indicate a feed that's going to be contributing to that inflammation that I mentioned.
You might as well feed a straight grain.
Absolutely, Bryan.
And save your money even further, because you probably will save $10 a bag just feeding a raw grain.
Well, the first ingredient that's listed on the feedback is normally the main one, and that may be 30% of the feed, and maybe 40% of the feed, and maybe 50% of the feed. So, as Bryan rightly said, if you've got a feed that's 9% fiber and it's got barley, corn, and meal run, well, you're probably better off feeding at least two of those and save yourself a bit of money.
Yeah, and with raw grains, the only safe raw grain to feed is oats. It's, as we said before, the starch is easily broken down. Corn and barley need to be boiled or cooked before that. But why spend that money or spend that time with it when you've got a good digestible starch source in oats?
Yeah, I find it as well with seasonal ingredients. A lot of feed companies state obviously 100 or 1,000 times bigger than what we are. They can't access the same ingredients throughout the whole year, so they do change ingredients seasonally. And look, we get feedback from some of the people that do the diets that, whether it's in the wintertime or the summertime, the batches do change in the feed that they use, and they do find that some of the horses react differently. Because if they're, let's just say barley's gone and, meal run comes in, it's going to take 2 weeks for that horse to start using that meal run as energy compared to the barley. So the horse can go backwards before it goes forwards. So every time there's a change of an ingredient, that horse needs a bit of time to adapt. On the flip side, we stick with the one ingredient. So we use the faba beans, we use the hull for the fiber, we use the kernel for the protein and digestible energy, and we've got a good balance where we've got pretty good protein, we've got high fiber, we've got low sugar and starch. The good thing with our feed, the grain-free ultimate, is that we don't go through the seasonal ingredients because we literally use one ingredient throughout the whole year.
Yeah, and I'll take it one step further now and add to what Pete's saying and I'll just type in Google cheap horse feed and on a budget, okay? And I'll click on one of the ones on the first page. We'll bring it up, and I reckon if we look at the ingredients lists on this, it'll be very vague. So without naming names, and we're just using this as educational purposes, the ingredients of this one, and I won't obviously try and give it away which product it is, but first ingredient is cereal grains. So that's what cereal grains are we talking about?
Is that like Cocoa Pops for humans?
and even another alarming term, vegetable protein meals, which our research suggests it's canola meal.
Absolutely, Bryan. The vegetable protein meals, the research that we've done is canola meal. There's not too many canola mills in Australia that actually produce canola through a cold pressing process. A lot of them are chemically extracted, whether it's hexane or what so forth. So you've got to look at the residual hexane in some of that canola that is put into horse food. So it's like I said, buyer beware, I suppose.
Yeah, and when we look at the detail, so I'll just go through and cherry pick some nutrition analysis. Like, you got the vitamin E at 200 IU per kg, which is 3 to 4 times less than what you need. So what's this feed rate on this one? It's 2.5 to 6 kgs.
Well, there you go.
So yeah.
So in essence, the feed is correct in terms of, well, you got to feed the 6 kilos or 5 kilos to hit the daily vitamin E requirements. The issue for the consumer is if you don't feed the 6 kilos and you feed 3, you're shortchanging your horse's vitamin E by 50%.
Yeah, and the price per feed is right up there. And what's this? This is a $27, $28 bag.
So in essence, is it cheaper or really it's maybe not smoking mirrors? It's cheaper for the person that's not feeding the recommended amount, but because you're not feeding the recommended amount, you're shortchanging your horse.
Yeah, and I think on a side note, these feed rates, even for our bags, they're very generalized. That's why we take the time in our diet consults to fully understand your individual needs, the way you train or the way your environment is for your horse, whether they're an easy keeper or a hard keeper. And there's many factors there, but the way our SEN program or SEN feed program is set up is it's very efficient. It's centered around roughage and that whole fiber source, and the cost per feed is actually cheaper than these budget feed bags.
I think how we differ is we try to put the focus and priority on roughage. So obviously whatever roughage you have, whether it's your grass, whether it's your hay, and we try to promote for the horse to get as much roughage as possible. Where we come in is we try to plug the holes in that roughage, okay, whether it's your hay, whether it's your pasture. Look, some pasture can even be up to 80, 90% moisture. So if you've got a 20% protein at 90% moisture, that's not really very high protein. So that's where you may have to add a loosen hay or something, or grass you loosen, maybe feed a little bit more of our grain-free ultimate product just to correct those deficiencies.
Yeah, there's always little tweaks you have to make, and every horse is treated as an individual, just like us humans. We react to certain foods and alcohols. And
is that what your Sambuca shots, Bryan? You can drink them like lolly water?
No, I've heard that tequila is actually a very good alcohol for us to digest.
Is that your Achilles heel?
I think so. I think it will be over Christmas. But I think overall, what we're trying to put out with this podcast is the real cost equation and how you have to compare these budget feeds to, you wouldn't say we're a premium feed, we're a feed that is designed around the physiology of the horse and not working against their body systems.
And please don't take this podcast as we're trying to scare the daylights out of everyone. It's just trying to get the message out that consumers really do need to read the back of the bag. You need to read the ingredients. You need to look at the levels. With Google and ChatGTP out there now, there's really nowhere to hide in terms of the spot checks that the consumer can do. Because at the end of the day, if your diet's out of balance, you're going to see it through your horse's health.
Yeah, 100% agree, Pete. And when we look at the feed rate versus the price of the bag, this is the insight that we're trying to give each horse owner. And what the take-home message about this podcast is it's the cost per day, not the cost per bag. The feed rate required to hit those National Research Council minimums for your specific horse. Add supplements required to fix that budget feed. We're trying to avoid that. Adding digestive consequences that may result from that budget feed, like colic, loose manure, or hindgut stress because of the poor ingredient profile or the unbalanced ingredient profile or nutrients. And then adding time spent to manage or prevent these issues. What we're trying to do is feed more efficiently so we don't run into these conditions. And the most expensive feed is the one that fails to nourish your horse.
That's well said, Bryan. Drum roll.
That's a one line.
That's your one line of the year so far. But it's so true, though.
Yeah, you can't put a price on health. And the mantra really runs deep in this day and age that we are what we eat and our horses are what they eat as well.
Do you want to maybe in summary, Bryan, just let our listeners know the SEN philosophy versus the budget feed philosophy as well?
Yeah, I think so. The biggest difference is our nutrition is built around the physiology. There's no secrets here that we love that roughage source going into them, that hay or pasture amount to be sufficient for that horse. It should be the center of their world and the center of their digestion. And that helps a lot of common conditions that horses in domestication do encounter. And if you get that right, complementing that with a quality, pure ingredient feed, which is the SEN Ultimate, balancing that with a good omega-3 source in our oil, not a rancid oil in a pellet. And our lower feed rates really complement the way a horse is designed to eat and digest their nutrients.
Just a summary and takeaway points for the listeners from my end. So as Bryan mentioned as well, don't get seduced by the bag price. It's important to look at the cost of your feed per day for your horse, including everything. So as I said, calculate the cost of your budget feed, calculate the gut supplement that you're feeding, calculate the magnesium, maybe additional calcium. It all adds up in the end, and the more things that you add, obviously the higher the cost, but also you could get caught in that trap that the more you unbalance the diet. So when we do these diets, a lot of the time we'll strip everything back, start with a base, and within a week or 2 weeks, the horse starts getting better. So that indicates an unbalanced diet. As I mentioned, calculate the cost per day. That's far more important than the cost of the bag. Look at the feed physiology, not the marketing. Don't get conned by the fancy shiny bag. Normally the shinier bag, the more unhealthy it is. Experience.
There is some glitter. I don't know. I think I saw a glitter bag the other day. I was like, wow.
Yeah.
Next level.
The gimmicks are getting better.
Yeah.
Look, premium feeds often cost less because you can feed less of it. So a lot of them are a lot more, obviously like ours, we've got pretty high digestible energy, but it's not through the roof where you're getting, barley through it and things like that. And if you've got a balanced diet, you don't need to feed high amounts of feeds. If you do need more calories, you've got like the silver bullet up your sleeve, which is the sen oil. Some of our endurance customers, they'll feed 250, 300 mil of the sen oil. That's almost equivalent energy to 800, 900 grams of oats, 300 mils of oil. You're not creating insulin spikes. You're getting the horse a nice healthy fat source that it's using for stamina, that it's using for energy. It's really healthy for their body, for their gut. So if you do need more energy, you can add it through fat rather than doing it more through hard feed. Prevention is always cheaper than correction. And invest in nutrition up front, like save the vet bills, save the corrective, shoeing with your farrier, save adding 3 or 4 different supplements into a feed that is already unbalanced from the beginning.
Yeah, there's many puzzle pieces in horse ownership and horse management, and if you can really get on top of your nutrition or the nutrients going in your horse, you're really going to set them up for their best possible job that they need to do for you. And that could be in any discipline that you ask them to with their training, or even if they're a paddock pony, they'll thrive with not taking any shortcuts with nutrition.
Absolutely. Any final messages, Bryan, before we part ways for Christmas and New Year's?
Yeah, I think one of the things we come across is that feeding horses doesn't need to be expensive, but can be perceived as expensive. And we kind of ask the question, expensive to what? Is when you look at how a horse is fed, is there a benchmark of how much that should cost per day? No, because you should be trying to meet their nutrient requirements first, and that is the true cost, if you know what I mean. Because some people go, oh, this way of feeding is expensive, but if you're not hitting the required amounts or the required nutrients, then it isn't expensive because you're shortchanging your horse's health on a daily basis.
That's well said, Bryan. And look, horses are not cheap to feed in the first place. So if your feed's costing you, that's unbalanced, that's creating problems, $4 a day, but yet you can feed the correct way, the healthy way, the balanced way for $6 a day. I mean, just have 1 cup of coffee or less at work a day.
Yeah. And what's the cost of performance? So that might be the cost of getting 20, 30% better performance out of your horse. The result at the end of the day, less issues down the track metabolic wise, or better muscle to support their structure, so less chance of injury. So there's so many hidden factors in owning horses, and there's no benchmark. The only benchmark is treating your horse as an individual and not trying to compare it to other horses, because they all have different various factors with genetics, the environment they've been, and the way their training is.
Well, if we scared the living daylights out of you, that was not our intention, but we do recommend that if you do like this podcast, obviously share it with your family and friends. We've got the Sen users group. Obviously there's a pretty big community of Sen users, obviously updating the results with their horses. We've got the diet consults, obviously, for Christmas, New Year's. We're closing for Christmas, New Year's. I think we're back on the 5th of January. Yeah. So if you are worried that you may be feeding this budget feed, like, please don't be scared, don't be embarrassed or nothing like that. It's all about balancing the diet. We have got the full turnkey solution with the Senor, the grain-free ultimate. We can look at your roughage, what exactly you're feeding. Obviously, can't forget salt. All horses need salt. A lot of people still don't feed salt, and they think there's enough salt in their current feed to meet the daily requirements. perish to thought, not even close in the middle of summertime. So we're here to educate. Obviously, we're pumped. We've had a really, really strong this year. A lot of new clients have obviously joined Sen and getting very good results on top of our existing clients. And look, some have been loyal for us for 10, 11 years, how long we've ran a business. Yeah,
it's so good. And we can't thank everyone enough for all your support of the podcast. We know many of you guys share it with your friends. They plant the seed with some of their friends that don't feed Sen, and eventually they will book a diet consult to see what it is like being part of our Sen family and really getting to know your horse. Peter and I really give our time to anyone that wants to ask the right questions, because at the end of the day, we're here to help as many horses as we can in Australia be fed the right way and to make horse owners' lives a lot more simpler.
Well, Bryan, when you got nothing to hide or nothing to lie about, it's easier to have that phone ring where you can speak to the owners of the business. And there's not many owners of the businesses that actually can pick up the phone and have a one-on-one conversation with you, even about one of your horses. We don't generalize you got to have 100 horses to call us. Can be 1, can be 2, can be 20. It doesn't really matter. It's taken us 11 years to obviously to zero into the current diet that we've got. And obviously we're always evolving with trying to improve it. But we seem to have the sweet spot now that the results that customers are getting are actually cost effective as well.
Yeah, and we're passing knowledge that when we consult even our real big clients in every performance industry, there may be little things in our experience that have worked that we can pass our knowledge down and give that idea for that troubled horse or a horse that hasn't thrived on another diet. And we know what works, and we've got the runs on the board, and we know our ingredients are the top shelf that we put together for our own horses as well. And yeah, we'd just like to thank everyone for a great 2025, and we can't wait for 2026.
Yeah, Merry Christmas to everyone as well, and Happy New Year, and we'll see you guys back again in the new year.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
Bye.